Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. It's always surprising how much conventional wisdom and scientific assumptions are often wrong. One such bit of wisdom is that the world's population will quickly overtake our ability to handle it. This has been drilled into our collective consciousness, certainly since Paul Ehrlichman's bombshell book, The Population Bomb, in 1968. Over the decades, the population explosion has been the stuff of both public policy planning and science fiction. After all, who can forget Soylent Green? But think how different the world was in 1968. Since then, the onslaught of technology, the great migration to our cities, and the rise in the social status, education, and contribution of women are all things that demographers arguably missed. So that today, as the population of advanced industrial nations age, as we are seeing in Japan, Europe, China, and the U.S., and the population is not even replacing itself, we face a population and economic crisis of a completely different kind. And now that problem might even get worse. Remember AOC's comments about people thinking twice about bringing kids into a world with the threat of climate change. We're going to talk about this crisis of declining population today with my guest, John Ibbitson. John Ibbitson is a writer at large for Canada's Globe and Mail. He's the co-author of one of the most important books about Canadian politics entitled The Big Shift, and it is my pleasure to welcome John Ibbitson here to talk about Empty Planet, the shock of the global population decline. John Ibbitson, welcome to Radio Who, What, Why.
Hello, Jeff.
Well, it's great to have you here. Why have demographers in the media consistently gotten this so wrong?
The United Nations Population Division has a really good track record at predicting population growth. They've been doing it since the 1950s, and they've been doing it well. And they predicted that by around now, we would be at 7.5 billion people or so, and we are at about 7.5 billion people or so. And they predict that by the end of this century, we will have gone past 11 billion. So there's every reason to believe that since the United Nations Population Division got it right in the past, that they're going to get it right in the future as well. That's a reasonable assumption. However, that assumption is flawed. There is another group of demographers who say that the United Nations assumptions are wrong, that the population is not going to get to 11 billion. It's only going to get to 9 billion sometime around the middle of the century. And then it's going to start going down and going down quite quickly. Darrell Bricker, my co-author, and I believe that these dissident demographers are right, that the evidence on the ground suggests that the UN assumptions are out of date and that they should change those assumptions. And if they do, the UN too will start to adjust its numbers to around 9 billion rather than 11 billion.
What are some of those assumptions that are fundamentally wrong? One certainly, and you talk a lot about this, is the shifting of the population from rural to urban. That's really one of the key indicators here.
It is absolutely the key indicator, and the United Nations fails to understand the pace of urbanization. We are now a mostly urban species. About 55% of humanity lives in cities. We've already seen this happening, of course, in the developed world, but it is happening at a tremendous clip in the developing world now as well. And when people move from countryside to city side, four things happen. First off, a kid stops being an economic asset, another pair of hands to work in the fields, and becomes a liability, just another mouth to feed. The second thing that happens, and this is perhaps the most important of all, women, when they move from the countryside to the city, have access to information they didn't have before. They have education, they have schools, they have media, they have other women who are able to educate each other. As women become better educated, invariably they begin to demand more autonomy over their lives. As they have obtained more autonomy over their lives, one of their first decisions is to have fewer children than their mother had. The third influence is one of religion, which is more powerful in the countryside than it is in the city. As the power of religion weakens, the ability of the priest or whoever to tell you that you must get married and settle down and have many kids weakens. And finally, the power of the clan weakens. You have fewer aunties telling you that it's time for you to get married and settle down and have kids. And your biggest influence is your co-workers and your friends, who rarely are urging you to have another baby. So economic, the education of women, the declining power of religion, the declining power of the clan, these all conspire to push down fertility rates once people move from the countryside to the city.
There is this assumption that has been prevailing for a long time that somehow population decline and drops in fertility rates and drops in population replacement was somehow a negative social indicator. That's not necessarily true.
No, absolutely not. A declining birth rate is everywhere in the world correlative with the increasing education and empowerment of women. And again, the declining fertility rates that we're seeing in the developing world go along with women in the developing world having more control over their lives than they had in the past. So yes, as women obtain better education and more autonomy, more ability to decide for themselves what they want to do with their lives, fertility rates drop. And in that sense, population decline is entirely a good thing.
To what extent are economics and globalization a significant part of what we're seeing here?
The globalization is helping to improve living standards in the developing world. And as living standards improve, education improves, fertility rates go down. So, I mean, we all know that the developed world has been below replacement rate for many years. And we have about 24 countries around the world that are losing population every year right now because they don't have the 2.1 fertility rate that's required to keep a population stable. So it's no surprise that Japan, for example, lost almost 450,000 people last year. That populations are declining in Eastern Europe and other parts of the developed nations in Eastern Asia as well. But China is going to start losing population in the next decade. It's the world's most populous country. It's below replacement rate. It will start losing population in the next decade. India has reached replacement rate. You can no longer look to India as this great source of population growth because they are now at 2.1. Brazil, the world's fifth largest country, they're at 1.8. They are well below replacement rate. And they are going to start losing population as well. So as you look around the world, well, where are the big centers of population growth? Where are the big places where lots and lots of babies are going to be born? Apart from sub-Saharan Africa, we are running out of places to produce those babies.
And as the population, the aging population, lives longer and the replacement rate continues to drop, talk about the economic implications of that.
They are challenging. So, yes, our thesis would be even more evident if longevity weren't increasing in the very same places where fertility rates are dropping. But they are. So people are living longer everywhere in the world, including in the developing world. But there are two consequences to that. First of all, when you have fewer young people every year than you had the year before, which is the inevitable result of below replacement fertility rates, then you have fewer young people who are able to pay the taxes needed to sustain all the old people who require health care and pensions. The other impact is on consumption. Economies are driven by consumption. That is the single most important factor in economic growth. Consumption is driven by young people who have graduated from school and are buying the first house or the first car, having their first kid, the stroller that's needed for the kid, the minivan that replaces the car for the kid. All of these things that 20-somethings and 30-somethings and 40-somethings and even 50-somethings acquire over the course of the decade, that drives economic growth. But when there are fewer of those people around, then there are fewer people to consume, fewer people to drive growth, and it makes it harder for society to continue to finance the things that it needs to finance to sustain the lifestyle that people are accustomed to.
As we look at population historically, is this something that is cyclical, or is this something that is more systemic right now?
Absolutely systemic. So if you look at 1800, an American woman, a white woman, and unfortunately there's no data for Native Americans or African Americans, but a white woman in 1800 would have 7 babies. A white woman in 1900 would have 4. So the United States halved its fertility rate over the course of the 19th century. And then it went down and down and down. And then the blip of the baby boom for a couple of decades made it look as though things were changing. But it was just a blip. And then it went back to going down and down and down again. And it's, in fact, the latest data shows that the fertility rate in the United States is at the lowest level it has ever been. It took the United States more than a century and a half to get its fertility rate down below replacement rate. But this is happening in a generation in most parts of the developing world. So it only goes in one direction, and it's accelerating.
And to the extent that it's accelerating, talk a little bit about how low it can go. What is the potential right now, given the other social and economic factors that we see?
It's a good question, and it may differ from culture to culture. So it may be that the United States, for example, levels out at around 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 and stays there. Canada has had a fertility rate of around 1.5, 1.6 now for several decades. But on the other hand, in Eastern Asia, the fertility rate is dropping below 1 in many places. It's dropped down to 1 in South Korea, for example. That's half of that's a whole baby less than they need to sustain their populations. So if it keeps going down to that level, then you could see really precipitous declines in population, again, in some of the biggest countries in the world. If China's population fertility rate begins to mirror the fertility rate in Japan and South Korea and the other countries on its borders, then we could see China lose not 300 million people this century, which is what they project, but up to 600 million people this century. And imagine what would happen to the world that we live in if China goes from having 1.3 billion people to only 600 or 700 million.
Of course, the other part of this is that when you look at this decline in places like China and Japan, for example, which are very homogeneous with respect to their population and have not done a lot with respect to immigration, there's real impact on the labor force in those countries.
A real impact on the labor force and a huge impact on geopolitics. You're absolutely right. Eastern Asia does not welcome immigration. The Japanese do not make it very easy for you to obtain Japanese citizenship. China does not welcome immigrants. The United States here has a tremendous advantage, and as well, my country of Canada has a tremendous advantage because we are immigrant nations. We are settler cultures. If the United States does not close the door to immigration, and I know this is a huge debate in the United States, but if you do not close the door to immigration, if you keep taking in about 1 million people a year, as you're doing right now, the gap in population between the United States and other parts, other places such as China, is going to narrow. This will be a huge geopolitical advantage for the U.S. Going forward. And it will also allow the U.S., again, to sustain its economy and its labor force in a way that other countries are unable to.
And it opens the door for huge debates about immigration in some of these Asian nations that we were talking about before.
Yes, the cultural imperatives of homogeneity in Eastern Europe is powerful. But the Japanese are now, for the first time, really grappling with this issue. How do they keep their populations from dropping below 100 million people, which is what they are at risk of doing over the course of the coming decades? They're talking about bringing in a great many temporary laborers to at least look after the issue of job shortages. But that's not a long-term solution. But we see the same thing happening in Eastern Europe. There are countries in Eastern Europe that are losing population, but are also closing their door to immigration. They would rather decline than prosper.
What are some nations doing, and China seems to be at least looking at some of these things to encourage increase in population, encourage the birth rate?
The Scandinavian countries have been at this now for decades. In fact, the social safety net that is thought of as a Scandinavian model was initially put in place to encourage Scandinavian women to have more babies because they were the first to really get at how serious a problem this could become for their economies. So what the Scandinavian model teaches us is if you spend a great deal of money to encourage people to have kids, if you have a year and a half fully paid family leave, if you have heavily subsidized daycare, if you have direct payments to parents for having children, you can increase the fertility rate of your society a bit, but you can't increase it by much. So you can maybe get it up to from 1.5 to 1.7 or 1.8, but you cannot get it up to 2.1. At least the Scandinavian countries have not succeeded in getting up to 2.1. And it is incredibly expensive. And when the next recession comes along, there's tremendous pressure to cut back on those programs, which is something we've also seen. And one of the reasons, in fact, the most important reason for this, is something called the low fertility trap. And you, Jeff, know exactly what the low fertility trap is, even though you've never heard of it. When you get used to having only one or two kids as the norm in a society, you get used to having only one or two kids as the norm in the society. You live in a world where your friends, people you know, your family members, everyone around you, your coworkers, they have one or two kids. If you knew a friend who said, we decided to have 6 children, you would go, that's odd. Why are you having 6 children? And so it just becomes the norm. It becomes expected. And having a child is something that you have for different reasons than you had in the past. You don't have it because God tells you you must. You don't have it because the state is encouraging you to. You don't have it because clan members are urging you to settle down. You have it because you and your partner want to have a child as an expression of the fulfillment of your own lives. As people discover that having children is something they want to do in order to express and fulfill their lives, they find out that 1 or 2 kids is all they need to get fully fulfilled. Some people just get a dog instead.
Right.
So once you're in that world, you're in that world. And we don't have any examples anywhere in the world where people flip back to saying, no, we want to live in a society where 3 is the norm. The women in those societies just say, no, we don't. I don't want to have a kid until I'm 29 or 30. That means I can only have 1 or 2. Career matters more. Disposable income matters more. Just other things in my life matter more. And my partner agrees with this, and that's how we're going to live our lives. Not much the government can do about that.
Right. All of those things, though, are social constructs and arguably certainly could be subject to being of a cyclical nature. Even population shifting is potentially cyclical. I mean, people may get tired of urbanization at a certain point and move towards more rural places, and that certainly potentially could drive population increase in the future.
Well, sure, but it's way beyond the scope of our book.
Right.
I think it is reasonable to say that the patterns that have been in place since the Industrial Revolution and that are still playing out in the developed world and now increasingly in the developing world will continue to play out for another generation or two. Which another, let us say 50 to 75 years. Well, let's just say to the end of the century. What will happen in the next century? Will there be a desire for people to migrate to the countryside? Will people just get lonely? Will they have been, I wish I wasn't just an only child. Let's you and I make sure that our kids have lots of brothers and sisters. That could happen. Who knows? What we know right now, though, is that migration patterns are beginning to slow down. They're rather disguised by the crisis that we're having in the Middle East. But as India moves to a replacement rate, as China is well below replacement rate, as the Philippines moves towards replacement rate, the sources of immigrants is going to go down. The Philippines, China, and India are Canada's 3 major source countries. Your major source countries are all south of the border. Almost all of the countries now in Latin America are at or below replacement rate. So the supply of Latino immigrants is going to start to diminish over time for that reason as well.
Is there any reason to think that climate change, the impacts of climate change, will have any effect on this?
No, that we know that this will have an impact on climate change. Mm-hmm. So the opposite is true, and this is the really good news. So we say in the book, population decline isn't good news or bad news; it's just big news. And we talked about the geopolitical consequences. We talked about the economic consequences. On the environmental side, it's all great. If we peak out at 9 billion at the middle of the century, that will help in our efforts to reduce global warming, to reduce carbon emissions, both because there will be fewer of us on the planet to produce emissions, and also because, and you've seen this happen in the United States, I've seen it happen in Canada, a lot of marginal farmland goes back to bush as people urbanize. And when that happens, the newly created bush acts as a carbon sink. And also increases biodiversity. In terms of biodiversity, in terms of food chain, in terms of renewing the oceans, everything is good about population decline on the environmental side.
Why do you think more people are not talking about this?
Well, we argue in the book that population decline is something that's happening here and now. It's happening in the decisions that you're making and that your readers and listeners are making. But it is also, on the other hand, kind of hard to get people to look at the impacts of that 40 or 50 years down the road. We're having a hard time getting people to understand the impacts of climate change, even though those impacts are starting to show up in weather systems right here, right now. So, and there is such an entrenched conventional wisdom of, nothing but population growth. Thanos is right. We have to wipe out half the population of the galaxy. All of those things are just so entrenched that even though a group of demographers have pretty good evidence, and Darrell and I traveled to 6 continents talking to people, not just experts, but we went into slums in Delhi and university campuses in Seoul to talk to young women in every possible environment. Even though there is this growing body of evidence that, in fact, population growth isn't going to go where a lot of people think it's going to go, you just have the dead weight of collective assumptions, conventional wisdom. And it takes a while to shift that.
John Ibbitson, Empty Planet, the Shock of Global Population Decline. John, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Been my pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.